Is the Napoleon movie bad? Hello, my friends, Takuya here. Welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And I posted a thing in my community page saying that I was going to be talking about Napoleon because, guys, I went and saw this movie a couple days ago, and I have to say that I feel very conflicted, to say the least. Especially since going into this film, I had months of anticipation. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of you went and actually saw the video that I did that was analyzing the trailer when that first came out, and I was pretty excited when all that came out. And then, of course, I went out and saw the actual movie, and as I said, I'm pretty conflicted on it. Of course, when we're talking about something like a film, there's many different ways that one can critique something. You know, you can talk about the historical accuracy, you can talk about the actors and actresses, you can talk about the performances, you can talk about how everything looks in it, and overall, a lot of that is just jumbled together in a way that, as I said, is confusing. Because really going into the entire thing, the movie versus my actual expectations of it were, like, the differences were very jarring. Because in comparison to the epic war drama that I thought that I was going to witness, instead, the entire movie seemed to play out more like a tragic love story. The story between Napoleon and his first wife, Josephine, with the revolution and the war and everything else that was going on during this time being a little bit more of a backdrop to it all, and it was weird. But I mean, does that mean that the actual movie itself was bad? What did the movie get right, and what did it get wrong, you may wonder? Well, if you go and pose that question to the internet, then you're going to get some very strong answers, some very strong responses, some that I found while doing research here for this video, and I mean, they don't leave anything to be said. From the Reddit Napoleon page, Napoleon movie is trash and everything is wrong about it. Bruh, I just watched this movie and it's so freaking inaccurate. Napoleon is showed as a deadly and sick psycho. All the battle scenes make no sense. It's some middle-aged melee battle, and there is no mention of this huge political and military work. His military genius is not even mentioned once. Most of his victory is under number. Well, this movie is anti-Napoleon, and there's nothing we can do. Not everything is negative, though. Some people have some more positive things to say, such as Phoenix portrays him as an extremely socially awkward man. Whether or not that's a true depiction, I'm not sure. The result was that he didn't really seem like a real leader nor a military genius. He was also far too old for that role. I can deal with a few inaccuracies, such as the presence at Marie Antoinette's execution, so that doesn't bother me, and I did think that the battle scenes were incredible, so I give it an 8 out of 10. If you actually then go back to the thread that I'm talking about here, the comments that are underneath are roasting that person who talks about it still being an 8 out of 10 despite all the things that are wrong, but it's still something that they can acknowledge the problems even while thinking that it still looked cool. As for critics, though, we're getting things like Mr. Phoenix Napoleon could never have commanded so much as a squadron of the Salvation Army, which is quite harsh. And though the movie is sprinkled with a few reasonably hardy battle scenes, overall, it's something like Mr. Scott's Waterloo, which I like to touch on that from putting in a historical reference saying that this was something that was a downfall battle for him. And then, of course, we will have some critics who kind of get to the crux of the problem while still simultaneously saying that it is a good thing, that it's definitely not your typical portrayal of a famous historical figure, and the better for it. And honestly, when we were going back and we were looking at this, it is probably that last statement on the matter that probably sums up a lot of the big problems that occurs with this movie. To some people, what is good, and to others, what is then terrible. The depiction of Napoleon that we are getting here is not the Napoleon of history. Like, that much is absolutely true. It is something that is significantly more complex than what you're going to see in a mere history textbook, yes, but it is also severely lacking in ways that you would not normally expect here. And so to that end, what I'm going to go ahead and do right now is I'm going to summarize the movie. If you want to avoid any spoilers of that, you can go ahead and skip through this part, but honestly, what is in the movie is the whole reason that a bunch of you are probably clicking on this here in the first place in order for me to go and analyze it. So if you don't really care about seeing it, then feel free, of course, to watch. So if we are going to sum up what Napoleon is a 2023 epic historical drama film that is directed and produced by Ridley Scott and written by David Scarpa. This is something that is based on the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, primarily depicting the French leader's rise to power, as well as his relationship with Empress Josephine, and the film stars Joaquin Phoenix as Napoleon and Vanessa Kirby as Josephine. The way that it all plays out, to summarize events, is that the movie begins in 1793 amidst the French Revolution. You have the young officer Napoleon Bonaparte, who watches Marie Antoinette get beheaded by a guillotine, and then later that year, the revolutionary leader Paul Barras has Napoleon manage the siege of Toulon, where he successfully storms the city and repels the British ships with artillery. Fast forwarding a little bit of time through the revolution, and after Maximilien Robespierre is deposed and executed at the end of the Reign of Terror, the French leaders, including Napoleon, attempt to try and restore stability to France. So again, using artillery, Napoleon would go and suppress the royalist insurrection on the 13th of Vendémiaire in 1795, which I'm probably mispronouncing because it's in French, and that's exactly what happens. Either way, moving on from that event, Napoleon would go on to woo the aristocratic widow of Josephine de Beauharnais, and the two would eventually go on to marry. Despite their very aggressive adult life, which I'm not actually going to be able to show or necessarily use stronger depictions of here because of obvious reasons considering it's YouTube, they don't manage to actually have any children. And that, for anyone who knows history, is going to be a serious problem moving down the line. Fast forward a little bit of time, and the movie then moves on to Egypt, where Napoleon would go to prevail in the Battle of the Pyramids in 1798, but he would then rush home after he learns that Josephine has an almost 10-year younger lover, a guy by the name of Hippolyte Charles. This sends him into a flying rage, and he returns back home to confront her, and when he does so, the Directory in charge of the country criticize him for abandoning his troops, but he then turns around and condemns them for their poor leadership of France, alongside several collaborators such as Talleyrand, Fouché, Sieyès, and Ducos, who subsequently then overthrow the Directory in a coup, where Napoleon will become first consul. As you can probably tell by now, we are moving forward at a very rapid rate, and that would become a standard for the movie. Napoleon is crowned as Emperor of the French by the Pope in 1804, during which he very brazenly takes the crown himself and puts it on his own head. The Foreign Minister of France, Talleyrand, would then suggest to Austria that France and Austria should form an alliance, but the Austrians by this point are dismissing him. Jump ahead by another year, and Napoleon goes and outmaneuvers and defeats the Austrians and the Russians at the Battle of Austerlitz, forcing them to retreat over frozen lakes before bombarding the ice and subsequently drowning them. After this event, he would go and invite the Austrian Emperor of Francis II in for wine, which the Russian Tsar Alexander I declines to attend, and tells Francis that since he did not destroy their armies completely, he expects them to be grateful for this. This is arguably the high point in the movie, and after this point it jumps forward yet again, where Napoleon's mother then has him go and impregnate a mistress in order to prove that Josephine is actually the one that is infertile. He then divorces his wife Josephine in 1810, publicly slapping her in the face when she initially refuses to read her portion of the decree. But for whatever reason, the two remain on good terms after this and continue to exchange friendly letters. Napoleon would go on to marry Marie Louise of Austria, who would then bear him a son a year later. Jumping forward yet again by a few years, in 1812, Napoleon would go on and launch his fateful invasion of Russia after Alexander goes and reneges on a peace treaty with France. He would ultimately prevail despite bloody guerrilla resistance by Cossack forces, and at the Battle of Borodino he would also win, but upon arriving he would find Moscow empty and later on be set aflame while he is there. Napoleon would then subsequently retreat during the winter to France, having lost around 500,000 men. In 1814, fast forwarding yet again after this, skipping all the battles, coalition forces would then force Napoleon's abdication and exile him to Elba. Napoleon decides to escape the island and return to power in France. And subsequently, when King Louis XVIII sends the 5th Regiment to try and stop Napoleon, he ends up charming them into joining him instead. Very quickly after this, it moves on to the Battle of Waterloo, the fateful moment in June, where Napoleon, having amassed more troops, goes and confronts the British army under the Duke of Wellington. French cavalry charges are then repulsed by British infantry squares, and the desperate Napoleon urges his remaining soldiers forward, but this advance is then decimated by reformed lines of enemy infantry. The forces of Prussian Marshal Blücher then arrive to reinforce Wellington, and the French are subsequently broken. As Napoleon retreats, he salutes Wellington, and that is about the end of the movie. Moving on after this, in rapid order, Napoleon is exiled, this time to the island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and from here he is seen bantering with children, writing his memoirs that would later become a worldwide bestseller, and presenting to his listeners a version of the story where he is always right. The final scene of the movie takes place in 1821, with Josephine's voice beckoning him to come and join her, and subsequently he would fall off of his chair and die, it seems. And that is the end of the movie. Now, holy crap, that was a lot, and we spread through this entire thing really quickly. For those of you who are watching this right now, I want you to understand something. We are talking about a period that is from 1793 all the way to 1815 for 99% of the movie here. That is 23 years of potential content that is being reduced down to a mere 2.5 hours. The result of which is that the theatrical version of this movie that I ended up watching is something that ends up feeling very rushed, with a lot of things that are missing. And when I say a lot of things, I mean a lot of things. Battles, character interactions, you name it, it's not there. That's one of the big issues with this movie. One can really only hope that when the 4-hour uncut version gets released that there's going to be more, but simultaneously considering what it has shown, I'm not necessarily too hopeful about that. Now, the majority of people are probably going to understand that cutting content in order to create a movie is something that just happens. That is something that regularly happens, so there's nothing we can really do about it. It's necessary. But when you pair that with historical inaccuracies, as well as bad or weird depictions of characters, events, or other things, that is something that ends up leaving a rather bad taste in people's mouths. And so what I'm going to have to actually do now here is I'm going to have to explain what is wrong with this movie and try to piece out how it is that I actually feel. First off, I'm going to go ahead and say this right now, but the director behind this thing in the first place, Ridley Scott, he is an individual that throughout the majority of my life, I have had nothing but respect for. Gladiator was easily one of my favorite all-time movies growing up, and I love so much of the work that is created. But how it is that he has responded to people criticizing his film, especially when it comes to historical inaccuracies, has been kind of bad. With one of the famous quotes that he has regarding the entire thing being, "When I have issues with historians, I ask, 'Excuse me, mate, were you there? No? Well, shut the F up then.'" And as crass as that is, technically speaking, he's kind of right. That is something that has a tendency to happen with historical films, and even to this day, when we are talking about historical events, a lot of things are up for debate. I mean, for one of my favorite movies of all time, as I said, Gladiator, this is the guy who created a story about a gladiator whose death ends up restoring the Roman Republic, which very obviously did not happen. So what is the big deal then? The major problem with the Napoleon movie is that the entire thing is really two movies that have been stuffed into one, and it doesn't really work that well there. When you first see the trailer for Napoleon, when I had seen it in the first place and then did that subsequent reaction, what you're going to think going into the film is that it's going to be some kind of epic war drama moving forward over time, covering Napoleon, maybe some of his stuff in the background here, dealing with his family and the other crisis, but it's going to focus on Napoleon. But really, that was not the majority of the movie. One of the two of these movies could simply be called Josephine, a Napoleon story, because the movie largely seemed to focus on Napoleon's relationship with Josephine and go into that in intricately more detail in ways that I didn't really anticipate going into this. It doesn't necessarily mean that that is a problem in some cases, it's just the marketing that went into advertising the movie in the first place did not give that impression, and it just felt like a bait and switch. The second movie, of course, is actually focusing on Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars and what happened with him. The problem with what they did is that trying to cram these two completely different types of movies into one movie over the course of 2 hours and 38 minutes, I mean, that is something that is a tall order for any director, for anyone to actually go and create. And in the end, it just doesn't really succeed, because we're not talking about something that is a time period of 3, 4, or 5 years. We're talking about a 23-year-long epic, something that took place from a key point in European history from 1793 all the way to 1815, and even then from 1821 if you want to extend it even longer. And as a result, the entire thing is just incredibly flawed. It is rushed. It is something that just doesn't really work. Because here's the major point. By trying to cram both of these movies into such a short runtime, it means that elements of both end up being sacrificed, and they just look weird. Like, just off the get-go, okay, when we were talking about the romance of this entire thing, it's not very good. The relationship that you see that occurs there between Joaquin Phoenix Napoleon and Vanessa Kirby just looks wrong and incredibly awkward. Not the least of which is because of their age difference, but we're going to be getting into that at a later time. I have an image of the thing here behind me, which I obviously cannot show the scene that we were talking about because it is a spicy one, but this is something that was incredibly painful to sit through, because rather than this powerful and cunning leader who is about to take the world by storm, instead Napoleon, for the majority of the movie, comes across as something that is more akin to a psychological case of a giant man-child. A whiny man-baby who very quickly becomes subservient to Josephine, someone who he is incredibly obsessed with, which, yes, he was obsessed with her in real life, that is true, but it doesn't explore any of that relationship at all and how that really comes to be. It just turns them into psychological basket cases. But either way, the movie. As I've already mentioned here a couple times, the actor for Napoleon is Joaquin Phoenix, the guy that you can see behind me right here. Now, I have nothing wrong with Joaquin Phoenix as an actor. In fact, he is brilliant. I love pretty much every single thing that he has been in, just without a doubt. Absolutely. But even with all the makeup and whatever it is that you want to put on, this is a guy that when Napoleon is a lowly artillery captain, someone who is in his early 20s, is tasked with breaking the siege at Toulon, he looks like he's like 40-something years old trying to lead this as just like a spry young man. plan, which is, it's not accurate. It doesn't look right. This is the area where British Navy warships are defending the royalist forces that are occupying this essential Mediterranean port. And what happens is that Napoleon has this very cunning plan to seize control of this undefended fort that is overlooking the harbor, and then subsequently use the guns that are in it in order to blow the British ships out of the water. So, going and putting on a disguise, he goes and performs reconnaissance around the fort himself in order to try and see where it is that they need to place explosives. And then after these go off, while the British soldiers are celebrating that night, he then sends French troops forward, including himself, to scale the walls for hand-to-hand combat. And he wins. As a result of this victory, he is then made a brigadier general, and it is the start of an illustrious career for him. And even if it looks a little off, a lot of this that we're talking about in the beginning is actually correct. Napoleon did indeed come up with a really good strategy here. It really is something that showcased his genius for tactics and would subsequently help him in his military career. And as a result from it, he would indeed receive a promotion. However, the capture of Toulon took place in 1793, at a time where Napoleon was 24 years old. So it's just, again, it doesn't really look right. Also, there's another inaccuracy here where the entire reason that Napoleon launches his strike in the first place is because his plan is approved by his friend Barras, but that's not true. He would only actually become friends with Barras in history after this because of his success in the first place. Like, he did that by his own merit, not from anything else. And it's after all of this is said and done that we get to go and actually meet Josephine. And I honestly have to say that this is probably one of the weirdest aspects of the entire movie. Because genuinely for some, this might actually be a small detail, but the actual issues that we're talking about here in the movie, well, the critique makes sense if you just hear me out. What Napoleon goes and does during this time is that he attends one of the big survivor balls, which, to explain what that is something that really goes back into a lot of the history of the French Revolution. This was essentially a celebration of aristocrats who managed to survive the Reign of Terror, a time where all of the aristocrats of the land were being executed, and many thousands were being held in varying prisons, including at the Bastille, who were awaiting execution. But when the Reign of Terror would end, this would subsequently allow for them to be freed. So there, across a crowded room, he sees this alluring figure of Josephine. She is the widow of a now dead aristocrat, and if you look at her, well, she kind of looks like she's in her maybe mid to late 20s, maybe her early 30s, around that time frame, and Napoleon is supposed to be a strapping young man, fresh out of war. Not exactly what I would anticipate here. Either way, despite the appearance, he immediately falls in love with her. He is absolutely smitten. But here's the weird thing, and why this depiction in the movie it really bothers me here. Not only does Joaquin Phoenix not look like the age that he should to play Napoleon at this time frame, it looks weird, but simultaneously, the actress who is playing Josephine looks significantly younger than what the actual Josephine was. See, the funny little detail here is that Josephine was in fact born in 1763. She was 6 years older than Napoleon, so the difference his face is here. It doesn't really look right. When it is that they went and actually got married in history, what she had done was she took 4 years off of her own age and simultaneously added 18 months to Napoleon's age, meaning that even though they weren't the same age, they would look to be significantly closer in age than what they actually were. But I guess a lot of people know already how Hollywood works with an older male actor and a younger female actress, and that's just kind of how the standard goes. The issue that I have with this is that by making Josephine so much younger looking in this is that it completely breaks the dynamic of the very toxic relationship that is being built up here in the first place. When I go and describe Napoleon in this film as a giant man baby, I'm not exaggerating that. He is quiet, he is very awkward, he can be very whiny, he doesn't know how to approach or really talk to seemingly anyone, especially women, which, yes, he didn't necessarily have as many skills or experiences as Josephine did when dealing with the opposite sex, considering their differences in experience, of course, but simultaneously, he was still a great orator, he was a great speaker, he knew how to actually talk to people, and instead, we effectively get a giant incel. And mind you, I'm not using that term as an insult in order to try and decry anyone. I mean that we are talking about the Hollywood depiction of a man-baby incel. That is the impression that he gives over the course of this film. And so his lack of skills would kind of make sense if he was depicted as perhaps a young man during this time period, but you can see all of the age and wrinkles and everything that is on Joaquin's face, and it's it doesn't look right at all. Besides just the skills in the bedroom, one of the other problems that this movie has with their whole depiction is that it shows Josephine going and improving his table manners and like turning him into a proper leader and a gentleman and an aristocrat and whatever. And that's not true. Napoleon wasn't just the crass soldier that Scott seems to want to depict. No, he was actually from a family of minor Corsican nobility. He was raised specifically with education to almost the same degree and social standing that Josephine was herself. They were pretty much on equal terms. He was a guy who simultaneously was known for his love of literature. He had a giant personal library, and he was a fan of Enlightenment thought. He had all of this stuff going for him, that he wasn't just some brute like what it tried to depict. Also, minor point that I just have to interject here. Napoleon did not meet Josephine in a crowded room like this at all. He was actually introduced to her by Barras. Like that's how things worked most often with courtship. You didn't just meet chicks at a party. You were typically introduced to them during this time period. That's how things went. But either way, moving on. All of this is then followed by the Egyptian campaign, as I talked about, where Barras goes and sends Napoleon to Egypt in 1794 with the goal at the time of liberating it from British influence and from there attacking England via its Eastern Empire. And so, deploying artillery as usual, because Napoleon was an artillery commander, he then goes on to fire a cannonball at the pyramids. And when people are obviously wondering, like, what the hell? Why is this something that is being depicted? That didn't happen. What the hell is going on? Scott would then go on to explain, well, I don't know if he actually did that, but, it was a really fast way of saying that he took Egypt. Okay, I guess. It didn't happen, by the way. Just giving a heads up. That did not happen. After that, there's this whole scene where Napoleon goes and investigates a golden sarcophagus that had been removed from its tomb. And then after touching the mummy that is inside, he kind of breaks it a bit. And then after this, he discovers from one of his soldiers that his wife Josephine has taken a lover. So he then hurries his way back to Paris, even though this is something that would be seen as deserting his post. And before we go and move on to that, I just have to talk about how this scene with the whole pyramids is something that just really bothers me, because while firing on the pyramids and destroying a mummy is something that possibly reinforces how he's just some thug that is moving in here, and even if he's smart, he is still destroying everything that he touches. That is not true for what happened with Egypt at all. That is a horrible dumbing down of what happened with Napoleon. It is not an exaggeration to say that the entire reason as to why we have Egyptology as a form of study in the first place is specifically because of the actions of the French here. When Napoleon went down to Egypt, when he went into Syria, when he went into this region, he brought with him over 100 scholars that specifically came down to research and catalog all of the stuff from ancient Egypt. He wanted the campaign to be more than just a military campaign, so he simultaneously brought all of these geographers, these historians, these economists, architects, everything, because he wanted to reinvent Egypt itself while simultaneously preserving its past. After Napoleon had won a major victory against the Mamluk army in Egypt, he then went on to take control of Cairo and for the next 3 months completely rebuilt it from the ground up, from all of its varying systems. We're talking about introducing street lighting, we're talking about cleaning it, we're talking about reforming the tax system, easing things so that the peasants were going to be bound to a feudal system, building modern plague hospitals, as well as changing how the city's administration and bureaucracy worked in the first place. At the same time that he did all of this, he built institutes that specifically were meant to study mathematics, physics, political economy, the arts, everything. And he did that over a period of just a couple months. None of his ability for any of this is shown. Instead, he is just a thug that kind of moved in, got cheated on, and then left. Which it also doesn't do right here in the first place, because, okay, if I'm going to go ahead and explain this thing and how this actually worked. When Napoleon sailed from Toulon to begin his conquest of Egypt, he left behind at Toulon his wife Josephine. Over the course of his journey down to it from Paris, he had wanted her desperately to accompany him, but she didn't want to go. Many officers' wives at this time would travel with them when they would go overseas in order to fight, but she hated this idea and cried all the way from Paris to Toulon, where Bonaparte would finally agree to let her remain in France and would follow up with her at a later date. Josephine would then travel to Plombières to take the waters in the hopes that would help her produce a son for Bonaparte, but that wasn't the only thing that she did. In truth, the reality of the situation, because this was Josephine, is that she did not want to be separated from her lifestyle, which was very luxurious, and also the lover that she already had by this time, Hippolyte Charles. Bonaparte did not know that any of this was going on at the time and had agreed to her demands and waved goodbye from his flagship L'Orient as it left for Egypt, and that's all that he really knew. The thing that it doesn't really show in the movie here in the first place, because it kind of gives Josephine a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, is that Josephine had never actually really been a faithful wife to Napoleon in the first place. Like at all. She straight up wasn't. Rumors about her being unfaithful, that was something that was common amongst the army. That was common in Paris society. That was common everywhere. And Bonaparte hated this. He knew already that she had had a lover, and this was something that had caused a major problem, but he believed by this point that he went down to Egypt that it was over, that it was done. It wasn't going to be a problem anymore. But instead of immediately just abandoning his post and going back home, that's not what he did like it shows in the movie. Instead, what he did is he threw all of his energy into completely reorganizing Egypt with his isolated army, because he was going to fix things, he was going to do it right, damn it, and then when he returned, his plan was to just divorce Josephine outright, because he wasn't willing to forgive her again for being unfaithful to him. Also, at the same time that this happened, he decided to get a little bit of revenge on her, so to speak, and decided that he was going to get a lover for himself, which we're going to get into here for a second, because again, that is also something that it does not show in the movie. For some reason, I don't know why. It would actually help with their whole toxic relationship thing that the movie was trying to push in the first place. Now, if Napoleon is going to get his cheating revenge on his cheating wife, then that means he's going to have to get with a woman. The problem was for him is that during his stay in Egypt, he didn't really want anything to do with any of the local women. That was a bit of a problem for him because he found them to be dull and undeserving of his attentions. No, it was going to need to be a proper French woman. The only problem for him in this situation is that in order to get a proper French woman, the one that had actually come with them and would be there in Egypt, meant that that was going to be one of the wives of one of his officers. Yeah. And so the one who ends up catching his attention is the young Pauline Fors, who is the wife of one of his lieutenants in the chasseurs. This is an individual who, I kid you not, became known as Napoleon's Cleopatra. And the whole story behind their relationship and the scandal and everything that came from this is just, that's something outright there. But the movie ignores this. It doesn't touch upon any of the complexity of all this. Instead, it just turns Napoleon into just a giant cock. That's all that he is. Also, it completely neglects any of the other problems that were occurring in Egypt at the time, because Napoleon did not just go and abandon his post because his wife cheated on him. He withdrew from the cities specifically because they were having massive problems finding food in the desert, as well as a frickin' plague that had broken out there, and they needed to get the hell out. Combine this with renewed resistance from the Egyptians that were being supported by the British, and yes, by 1801, the French would go and withdraw in defeat. But hey, at least from all of this, again, it would basically start the topic of Egyptology in the first place, so that's something. So yes, moving on from history and the movie, he does go back to France, and from there he does end up confronting his wife, where one of the scenes that you see, and I can't exactly show everything that is in here obviously, but if you go and watch the movie, you see a cartoon that is depicting Napoleon where he is being mocked as a cuckold by the newspapers. Did this actually happen? Yes, and this is actually something that did impress me with the film. They got that right, but they actually even toned it down. It was way worse. The British had an absolute field day with the infidelity of Josephine. They really did. As for how they got access to any of this information in the first place, what happened is that the letters that Josephine would write to her lovers ended up getting intercepted on a ship that the British captured, which meant that the British got full access to it and then published them everywhere in every newspaper that you could imagine. So, of course, this was a huge embarrassment. Genuinely funny and genuinely real moment there. Yeah, that was, wow, yeah, that actually happened. Anyway, what subsequently happens after this is that the movie ends up skipping through a lot of politics and battles until it finally gets to the Battle of Austerlitz. And I'm going to go ahead and say this right now, but if you go and watch the trailer, when you first see this battle being represented, it is something that does look incredibly cool. It is something that takes place on a frozen field in Central Europe, and here you have Napoleon Bonaparte, the supreme general and emperor of France, who holds the high ground. And from a well-fortified and concealed position among the trees, his army lays a trap for the forces of the Austrians and the Russians. And from this position, they watch as the enemy stumble right into their trap and subsequently get massacred. In the chaos that follows, thousands of different men, horses, cannons, everything that you can possibly imagine try to get away from the French and their artillery, but it does not work. As the Russian army desperately tries to retreat back across the frozen lake, Napoleon goes and has his cannons aimed directly at the ice. And as they fire in, it causes the entire thing to begin to crack and fall apart. Men, horses, cannon, everything fall in agony into the ice and into the icy water. Something that I'm not even sure necessarily what it is that I can show here, but it is a powerful, it is a crazy, it is a epic scene as just thousands of men seem to be lost from this. It is a stunning victory for Napoleon. Like, I'm going to try and show what it is that I can here. I don't know what it is that I'm going to be able to do because YouTube, of course, is a very fickle beast with exactly what you're going to be trying to put up. But there is this scene, this incredibly powerful scene of a single horseman trying to escape, waving his flag, getting out as quick as he can on his horse. And just as you think that he is going to escape, he gets completely obliterated and falls beneath the ice, perishing. The entire thing is terrifying and powerful, and it truly is impressive, but the question that a lot of people and where a lot of complaints came from during this time was regarding its accuracy. And hear me out for a moment, because this is actually something that I do not fault Ridley Scott for. It's something that is understandable. The Battle of Austerlitz is easily one of Napoleon's greatest examples of being a tactically brilliant man. It is on that day that the French ruler would completely defeat the Austrians and Russians at the same time, despite the other empires that came to meet him in the field having the greater numbers. This is a battle that over the course of the 19th and even into the 20th century was something that was heavily romanticized as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Austerlitz was a massive turning point for Napoleon. It was a climax. It was one of the greatest things that he had ever done and probably would ever achieve. It was one of the most concerted efforts by France's enemies to try and bring him down, and it failed horribly. The culmination of what we are talking about here, something known as the War of the Third Coalition, the Battle of Austerlitz occurred after the allied forces of Great Britain, the Austrian Empire, and the Russian Empire, along with Naples, Sicily, and Sweden, all went to war to try and stop him. The movie is correct in trying to depict the battle as a massive trap, because that's what it was. Prior to the battle, Napoleon attempted to cultivate a false sense of security from the significantly larger Austro-Russian army, and this was achieved by sending false information that Napoleon's men were actually starving, that they were demoralized, they wanted to go home, and that with the coming winter, it was going to be a big problem for them. He also seemed to weaken his position on the land near the town of Austerlitz, an area known as the Pratzen Heights, thereby suggesting that the French were in the process of trying to abandon their positions. Napoleon would even resort to play acting for the Russian envoy during the month before the battle, because reportedly during the meeting that he had with this Russian prince, Napoleon would affect a kind of nervous tick in his face, something to suggest that the French emperor was terrified of the Russians and didn't actually want to fight them, thus giving them a false sense of confidence. And so it was then that on the morning of December 2nd, that the enemies of France, urged on by an overconfident and tactical novice that was Tsar Alexander I, took the French bait and descended on what they thought were abandoned positions along Pratzen Heights. But in reality, what had happened was that Napoleon had divided his forces amongst a handful of generals in varying different concealed locations around the trap. And from this, the French army would then cut the Austro-Russian army to pieces. While the War of the Third Coalition would go on into 1806, it was effectively over when a humiliated Austria would end up signing a peace treaty with France on December 26th. This being after Napoleon did, in fact, mock the Austrian general by offering him French wine following the slaughter at Austerlitz, which left anywhere between 16,000 to 36,000 coalition soldiers dead. In comparison, the French only lost around 9,000. The record that we're talking about here in this case is truly impressive, as Napoleon's victory over the Austro-Russian forces here in that December was complete and total. It was absolute. And the writings that came after this battle talking about it knew that, with one of the biggest and most influential pieces specifically coming from the French general, Adolphe Mabeuf. The account that he wrote about the Battle of Austerlitz is something that would go on to inspire writers for over a century, specifically writing that the Russian forces would flee in a panic across a series of frozen ponds only to be sent to a watery grave, and quote, thousands of Russians with their horses, guns, and wagons would slowly settle down into the depths. Which, if you went and watched that movie, or if I was able to actually play any of the scene of what it is that I'm talking about, you would know what it is that I mean. That is what it showed. That is what Ridley Scott went and put out there. And for decades afterwards, this is something that would be the accepted wisdom of precisely what had happened with the battle. As an account in the 1850s would later write, quote, a division of the ruined army consisting of many thousand men and horse sought to escape by crossing, with artillery and cavalry, a frozen lake which had joined their line of march. The surface began to yield beneath the enormous load when a few balls and shells from the French batteries broke the ice, and the whole mass was plunged into the freezing waves. A fearful cry resounding above the roar of battle ascended from the lake as the frantic waves closed silently over them, and those unhappy victims were sepulchered forever. Even later, Tsar Alexander I, the guy who had fought in the battle on the opposing side in the first place, would confess to aristocrats in Vienna in 1814 that he was helpless as he watched 20,000 Russians sink beneath the water. 20,000! And now that is a lot of people, and for over a century, this became the accepted version of precisely how this battle went down, until historians actually began to wonder, hey, wait a minute, hold on. If 20,000 Russians, or possibly more, and that's not only the men, but also their horses, their artillery pieces of everything fell under the water, wouldn't there have been like a ton of bodies here? Wouldn't we have proof of that? Because once things thawed in the spring, that's gonna reveal a really grisly scene. Which made people start to wonder then, okay, wait, was the stories of the Battle of Austerlitz, was that French propaganda? And yeah, it seems to have been. There was an Oxford historian by the name of Reginald L. Poole who said as much in an influential article that he would write in the English Historical Review in 1902. And in Poole's research, he discovered that the accounts of the weather in the local newspaper in early 1805 reported that the ice was relatively thin, meaning that this was something that was unlikely to be able to support a full army that was moving on it in retreat in the first place. Poole also discovered that on Napoleon's orders, the French army went and drained the lakes within a few days of the battles, whereupon the recorded discoveries found between 28 and 30 cannon and the corpses of around 150 horses, but only 2 or 3 human bodies. Furthermore, in the century that passed, there was no other human remains, or any remnants of any cannons, or anything else that could be found that were discovered around the lakes. So what Poole would go and argue here is that if the ice did actually break, this only would have occurred as soldiers were fleeing around the edges of the frozen bodies of water. And like, yes, some of them potentially would have been crossing into it a little bit, but the amount is drastically exaggerated. The majority of them would have actually fallen in around the outskirts, and most would have been able to escape unharmed, except horses have a much worse time in that scenario, which is why there's probably more bodies of horses. Not to mention, though, the movie makes the entire thing look like it's on one massive giant lake, and that's not true. It was in fact more of a series of ponds that all of this occurs in, so it's not really accurate there. And so in the century since this article came out in the first place, historians have continued to argue as to how many soldiers went and perished in the water in the first place, with the numbers now being drastically reduced, with most saying that it was anywhere between 38 men to maybe a few hundred, though some still insist that it may have been even a few thousand, but not 20,000. So why exaggerate just the sheer slaughter of all these Russian and Austrian forces? Why? Well, I mean, if you actually go and watch the movie, if you actually see the scene, it is a very powerful scene. It is something that is stunning. And in this time period that all this takes place, the French need some kind of massive propaganda move. They need something that is going to showcase their power and potentially stop their enemies from being able to come and attack them, to completely break the will of the Austrians and Russians to fight. And so yes, a lot of people are specifically mad at this scene in this movie because, oh, it's not accurate, but in reality, the movie is going off of the propaganda that the French and even the Russians and Austrians and others had been spreading for literally decades after this. Like, there's a historical basis for this in the first place. I will grant Ridley Scott that is true. And so moving on from this, because basically all the politics and battles and everything else past this point has to be skipped, because that's what the movie seems to want to consistently do, after all this goes down, Napoleon ends up being crowned as Emperor of the French, with Josephine as his Empress, but then of course he starts to get really concerned that he doesn't have an heir yet, that Josephine hasn't been pregnant. And so in order to find out whether or not the fault lies with Josephine, even though she's already had 2 kids, so I mean, one would normally think in that scenario that had settled the matter, or whether it was with her son, Napoleon's mother, I kid you not, goes in the movie and puts an 18-year-old girl in Napoleon's bed and basically tells him, yeah, try to get her pregnant. And he does. In the movie. The weird part about all of this is that even if Napoleon's mother did actually do this, it seems to have been unnecessary. Remember that Josephine had cheated on Napoleon repeatedly, and so in response to her cheating, he went and cheated on her repeatedly. Like that's something that he had a lot of mistresses by the end of this. Josephine had already caught her husband in the bedroom of one of her ladies-in-waiting, a woman by the name of Elizabeth de Vaudey, and this was shortly before they were coronated in the first place as Emperor and Empress. At which point, Napoleon then proceeded to threaten her with a divorce because, well, she couldn't produce him an heir, it seems. Then in the year 1805, he would go on to to meet the 18-year-old Eleanor Dunel de la Plagne, who was part of his sister Caroline's household, and also from this, weirdly enough, was already sleeping with Caroline's husband. So Napoleon would set up Eleanor in a house in Paris, and in December of 1806, she would actually give birth to Napoleon's son. And he had a second illegitimate child in 1810 with another mistress by the name of Countess Mary Oleska. So, I mean, there definitely wasn't a problem with Napoleon. I don't know why they didn't show any of the stuff of him actually doing stuff on his own. It's like every single thing that is suggested for Napoleon, he is too weak-willed to actually do himself. He doesn't have any of it. It's like all being suggested by the people around him. Again, whiny, indecisive, man-child. That's how they depicted him over the course of this entire movie. Moving on from that to the actual divorce between Napoleon and Josephine, I don't have an image of the actual scene behind me, but, you know, it's Napoleon with his arm raised, so you might as well be shown that, even though it's a completely different scene from way earlier. But one of the most inaccurate moments in this movie overall is easily when Napoleon goes and slaps Josephine during their divorce proceedings. That did not happen, and that would be extremely out of character for Napoleon's character. It's just, it doesn't make sense as to why this happened. They did it specifically for dramatic flair to like show him as some crazy ass. There's literally no proof of any of that happening, as most historians believe that Napoleon was too obsessed with Josephine to actually ever lay a hand on her that way. They literally just added him in abusing her for dramatic flair. Anyway, all of that goes down, and of course that moves us on fast forward a couple years, and Napoleon is now at war with Russia, and it brings us to the final question that brings us in of, was Napoleon defeated by Russian winter? Because it's the classic tale that everyone likes to talk about when it comes to Napoleon and Russia. But the funny thing is, this is actually false, and the way that it depicted his invasion of Russia is both true and simultaneously false at the same time. It's a really mixed bag when it comes to this. See, in the film, Napoleon's win during the Battle of Borodino would convince him to move on to Moscow and then initiate the Russian campaign. However, what happens is that Napoleon underestimates one thing. Russia gets very cold in the winter, and his forces aren't exactly prepared to deal with it. By the time that he gets there, Moscow is empty and it is set on fire, and over the years, the event would be dubbed the Russian Winter, with people saying that Napoleon, of course, had no way to withstand the winter, to withstand General Frost. But most historians have debated the accuracy of this over the years because it just doesn't really add up. For starters, the greatest problem that the French actually faced during this time was the sheer number of losses that they experienced during the summer and autumn seasons, because lice had become a notable problem during the warmer points. It had also come out to light that a breakout of typhus had also claimed the lives of many of Napoleon's soldiers, and so ultimately these parasites, along with dwindling supplies, would doom the French before winter ever actually set in. Similarly, it is true in the movie when it shows that Moscow had been evacuated prior to Napoleon ever arriving in the first place. But what is not true, what does not happen, is that Napoleon doesn't arrive there and then they set Moscow on fire. No, as it turns out, the Russians had already set fire to the city before Napoleon ever arrived. So this scene that has Napoleon waking up in flame and wondering who did it, who set the city on fire. No, that's not how that all played out. It's just weird. Moving on from that, the movie then skips ahead by 2 years. It completely skips the entire retreat from Moscow all the way to 1814 when Napoleon goes and abdicates from the throne in the first place, as though it's suggesting that these things are directly caused by one another. And to be fair, when we were talking about this, there is of course the idea that the losses that Napoleon faced in Russia, he had no real way to recover from, which in turn would lead to his ultimate defeat. But it completely downplays all of the events that happened in between, because again, the movie continuously skips over everything. The movie goes and completely downplays the role of the War of the Sixth Coalition in his abdication. This would see the alliance of forces from varying countries such as Austria, Prussia, Russia, the United Kingdom, Spain, Portugal, and others all go to war with France. It completely omits the Battle of Leipzig, which is considered one of the largest battles in European history before the First World War, and these events are what are credited to bring about Napoleon's exile to Elba before eventually, of course, he escapes, returns to power, and then gets defeated at Waterloo. So again, it goes and skips a good 2 freaking years. 2 of arguably some of the most important for this entire thing in the first place. And that, then, of course, brings us to Waterloo. By the time things reached the Battle of Waterloo, I have to say that I was arguably by this point thoroughly disappointed. Instead of being some massive climactic moment filled with back and forths across the battlefield, instead the entire thing appears to be just a one-sided slaughter of the French, which is not how things for Waterloo went down whatsoever. It doesn't show any of the nuance of the battle. It doesn't show any of the skills. It doesn't show anything for Napoleon having a detachment of men that specifically were trying to keep the Prussians at bay to allow him to take on the British. And it is that failure that would allow the Prussians to march in and reinforce the British, ultimately leading to his outright loss. That doesn't happen. None of that occurs. What does occur is that we get a scene of Napoleon leading a cavalry charge across the battlefield. And that didn't happen. Napoleon was never a horseman. In fact, he is famous for not typically riding larger horses, the larger thoroughbreds. He always rode smaller ponies because he was trained as an artillery officer, not a cavalryman. And so this scene of him trying to ride at the British, getting absolutely decimated, and then riding away, saluting the Duke of Wellington, and then leaving was just, God, I can't, I'm stumbling now in here so bad because it frustrated me so heavily. And then that's it. That's the movie. And this then brings us to how it is that I actually feel about the movie, where I am quite conflicted. Because on one hand, actually getting a deeper look at the inner psyche of an individual like Napoleon is fascinating because it's not all just about war and battle and politics, but simultaneously, over the course of this movie, it showed nothing positive really of Napoleon that would actually make people want to follow him in the first place. Almost every single aspect that we see about Napoleon over the course of this movie does not show him as a genius military leader. It does not show him as a politician. It does not show him as someone who is really capable of leading. Instead, over the course of this movie, Napoleon is instead depicted as a narcissistic cuckold. Because yes, I'm sure that many of us understand that the depiction of Napoleon as a narcissistic cuckold is something that is true, but simultaneously the movie completely ignores any of his genius, his charisma, anything that actually made him arguably one of, if not the greatest general of all time. And none of that is reflected in the Napoleon movie. Like, over the course of Napoleon's rise to power, everything that happens in here, from like the coup the 18th of Brumaire, and even the decision to crown him as emperor, these are not thoughts that Napoleon initially has for himself in the film. Instead, they have to be given to him by people who are more intelligent, who are thinking these things through, and then he just does it. It really gives the impression that Napoleon didn't have as much of a hand in his own success as what he actually did. And the battles that it shows really aren't all that much different. Like, yes, over the course of, say, the Battle of Austerlitz, we do get an example of Napoleon actually going and ordering out his men out of being able to do things, and we can see it all kind of play out, which is arguably one of the only demonstrations we have of his military capabilities for the entire movie. There really isn't anything else. And so because for the majority of the movie, it makes Napoleon look like some giant whiny man-child, it really makes one wonder, when watching it in the first place, how, in the first place, did Napoleon manage to take over anything at all? How was he such a big threat to Europe? Because he doesn't seem to be. And when you combine this man-child depiction with the fact that the first 2/3 of the movie seem to focus significantly more on Napoleon's relationship with Josephine, and that's pretty much it. Like, I get, yeah, there's a really good story there. There is something that we could really dive into. It just does not really help that since Napoleon is such an awkward man-child, that none of their interactions or anything seem to really be believable at all. In the end, as I said earlier in this video, the film of Napoleon feels more like two different films that have been crammed into one, with one of those films being the twisted, toxic relationship between him and his wife, and maybe a third or a quarter of the film actually going into the battles and power struggle and everything in Napoleon himself. And that just, like, the combination does not work. The portrayal that we have of Napoleon here is just some whiny brute, is something that unfortunately reeks of British propaganda. It's not accurate or good. And when you combine all of that with the rapid pacing of the film, with the fact that it skips through 23 years of content in rapid order to be able to tell the story, it, from that, fails to tell it accurately or do justice to really any of it. Despite the fact that this is a 2.5-hour long movie, it feels incredibly rushed, and many of the parts of it feel boring. And that is something that honestly makes me sad, considering how much I was looking forward to this film in the first place. In the end, this whole thing is coming off a little bit more of a opinion piece from me here than I really desired, because I will admit, fully going into this, that I had my hopes up going into this movie, and I left thoroughly disappointed. There are many more analyses that we can do here in the future of varying movies, TV shows, and other things, and pointing out what is wrong, because unfortunately that seems to be something that is very common with Hollywood. I already have my eye on what is going to be happening with the new Hannibal Barca production. Everyone, thank you very much for watching. This has been Stuckuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. I appreciate all of you. If you could like, comment, and subscribe, doing anything that possibly helps me here in the algorithm, then I would greatly appreciate it. You all are wonderful, and I hope to see you all again here in the future. Thank you, my friends, and goodbye.